myself a holistic psychotherapist and an intuitive coach. I'm also a healer. So those are a selection of titles. I think all of that sort of melds together in a process of personal development. Because I'm Jungian trained, and he talks about individuation, which is the process across a lifetime of working towards wholeness. And I take whatever my intervention is in the process of somebody's life as part of that. So obviously I wouldn't be there for the whole of their life, but I consider that what I do contributes to that life process. So it's a slightly different view on therapy than some maybe, because I take the bigger picture or the longer view in terms of our seeking our own truth and our personal development. And I would like to think that I'm part of that process in someone's life. So I come into someone's life at a point where they feel they need input from another. And hopefully we then work together to find out what it is that is troubling them, because people often come to therapy when something is troubling them, when something rises up from the unconscious and they begin to become consciously aware of it. We're mostly working with what is called the shadow, which is the stuff we don't know about until we suddenly feel or see ourselves behaving in ways that we don't necessarily think like very much, or maybe it's not even about not liking it or liking it, but it's a surprise to us. We suddenly discover a part of ourselves that we didn't know existed, or it causes us trouble, or it changes how we relate with our significant others. And we want to know what that is, or why it is, or how to change it even. Like most therapists, it started with my own journey of self-discovery. And that certainly has been a lifetime's journey. I would say I had a very difficult childhood and was really distressed by what had happened to me. But I didn't really know that in my youth and earlier years. I just behaved without conscious awareness of why or how, even sometimes. And then my marriage broke up. And I began questioning then who and what I was. And I guess it's often our most painful experiences that drive us to asking the questions why and how, and is there anything I can do about it? So I went into counselling a year or two before my marriage broke up. That started me on the journey of discovery and opened up my curiosity, and has been an amazing journey of pain and joy for the rest of my life, but I couldn't have it any other way. And in discovering so much more of myself and understanding how the trauma of my early years affected all of my subsequent relationships, still does, but in a slightly less harmful way these days because I'm more self-aware. So that really kick-started my journey of self-discovery, and through self found others. And that's what led me, I guess, to start working with others. So it's always looking in the mirror of self-discovery, looking in the mirror of which parts of me I see in others, and for them the same. That started me on that journey. So there's been a lot of trauma. I needed to learn an awful lot about trauma myself to help me recover, and in essence became the therapist that I needed myself that I couldn't find at the time. I think there is a lot more trauma awareness now, and there are many more therapists out there who have awareness of trauma, which is great. I mean, it's changing the perception of mental health, and that's amazing too. But when I first began to realize that trauma was my major wounding, developmental trauma. There wasn't so much information out there, and I had to discover it the hard way, sadly. But what it meant was I ended up doing a lot of researches and a lot of additional training focused on trauma and its effects on us. And so now work extensively with complex PTSD. My process has primarily been for me. And I have found in that journey of self-discovery that I can support others in their own self-discovery. That's it in a nutshell, really. That's a very long answer to that question, because trauma affects different people differently, because we all respond differently to external stimuli. But basically, if in terms of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, we're talking about the stuff experienced that was traumatic in childhood, and that affects how the brain, heart, and mind develop. So it's dysfunction, parents not being able to be the ideal parents for their children. And let's face it, nobody's an ideal parent, but most of us love our children, and that means that children then grow up basically with a sound, grounded sense of self in the world. But when that doesn't happen, then developmental trauma occurs. So if you think for a moment that the human fetus is born underdeveloped compared to many other mammals, because our head is too big and our mums would not be able to physically give birth. So the brain develops postpartum, which means that it reacts not to an internal enclosed womb environment. It reacts to an external, massively different environment for all of us. There is so much diversity in a baby's experience once born. And those things that happen to us then affect the way the brain continues to develop. And our brains continue to develop very much so in the first 20 years of our living. It remains, the brain remains plastic throughout life, and therefore changeable throughout life, which was previously not believed. But there's been much discovered about brain development in recent years. But the brain is very much like a sponge when we're very young. And so anything that's dysfunctional and not loving, and therefore not safe, that happens to us when we are very young affects how the brain develops and can become complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Symptoms of that can be not able to maintain relationships, getting into relationships with people who hurt us a lot, not being able to sustain relationships, feeling alone, alien, highly sensitive, not able maybe to focus fully on our life, or not even feel fully present, anxious, depressed, very nervous, multiple other symptoms, which would take probably an hour here. But if you are distressed by the way you are living your life and the way things are panning out for you, then it would be worth looking to see if you have suffered trauma. There is also what contributes to our trauma is inheritable trauma. So you may have heard of epigenetics. And what epigenetics is about is the fact that our genes change when we experience trauma. So if your dad or your grandmother, say for instance, lived through war and lived through the fear of war, that alters the way their genes operate in the body. Some parts of the genes switch on, other parts of the genes switch off, and those are the genes that are inherited by subsequent offspring. So they can be born traumatized. And this was discovered when studying the parents and the children of people who lived through the Holocaust. And of course, those parents had significantly altered genes, and the children were born traumatized. So we can be traumatized by stuff that didn't happen in our lifetime. in fact, all of us are, if you think about it, because all of us will have trauma somewhere in our ancestry. Obviously, the effect of it diminishes across generations, but it depends what else happens. So there is no such thing as an untraumatized life. Trauma is normal. It depends on the extent of it as to whether we develop complex PTSD. But even if we don't, we might have mild trauma effects that change the way we relate. So because I'm highly alert to those symptoms, even if somebody would not be diagnosed with complex PTSD or trauma effects, we still look at it in a traumatic sense, which means that I'm not just looking at the mind, I'm looking at the body and the heart and a person's energy and their spiritual outlook or their purpose in life. All of that needs to be addressed for people to recover from their trauma. So hence the holistic approach. Well, I suppose I've explained some of that already in terms of we heal across our lifetimes, and the purpose, part of the purpose of coming here is to do that. So we need to focus on our self-awareness. Not everybody chooses to do that, and that's absolutely fine. But from where I'm sitting, I believe that is the purpose of living. I do believe, because of my work with trauma, trauma is about fear, and the world's not safe, and we need to take certain actions to make it safer. Some of those actions are healthy, some are not. But we come from a place of fear with trauma, and it's encased by the body, heart, and mind. And the purpose of recovery, the purpose, what becomes the purpose of life, is to move from fear to love, in my opinion. And we can't truly feel love until we have a great deal less fear than that which trauma instills. So growing across a lifetime, we move towards that greater sense of wholeness, that individuation, by coming to understand and love ourselves. And as we do that, we embody that and can give it to others and receive it from others. All the while we are fearful and defensive, love doesn't get through that. It's hard to feel it, it's hard to believe it exists, and it's hard to live by it. So I suppose my underlying philosophy is one of continuous growth, moving from fear to love. And that's in each lifetime. So I come from a spiritual stance of believing in reincarnation and karma, and that we have more than one lifetime to learn about what the universe is all about, put very simply. So, I mean, that's a whole other exploration, but it's obvious from what I say on my website and the way that I work, is that the spiritual element, how we believe the universe is structured energetically, whether we believe in something greater than us, is important to me personally. That doesn't necessarily need to come into the therapy, but particularly in trauma recovery, there will always be a conversation about moving forward into your life. As you recover, you move forward into a life where you're less traumatized and able to be in a more loving position. What has become the purpose of living for you? So somebody may never use spirituality as a word in their vocabulary or in their philosophical understanding, but to me it's important that they have an understanding of why they are there for them. What's the point of it all? Do you believe in something larger than yourself in the universe that you can rest on in times of strife? I think that's important to all of us, and we need to refine that. And I do think that Western society has kind of left that behind a bit, but I do think it is deeply, deeply important to us as human beings to have a belief in there's something more here going on than just me living my hedonistic life. there is always a way through if you're prepared to do your work, that it can change and feel better. I don't say that your original troubles will go away and it'll all be flowers and sunlight and fairies and everything's fixed and you're fine forever forward, because we forever work with our challenges in life, and life is continually presenting us challenges from outside ourselves, but primarily from inside ourselves. In other words, how we interpret what comes at us from outside ourselves, because we will have a slant on that. We're all biased. We can't help be anything else. There is no objective reality. There is a way of learning strategies that enable you to deal with your challenges differently, perhaps more peaceably, perhaps in a more accepting way, that stresses you less. There isn't a magic pill to make you all better. That doesn't mean the journey is not worth making of self-discovery. It absolutely is. And it's about behaving more consciously. We therefore become more considerate of ourselves and more considerate of others. And how could that not be hopeful? I'm a healer first, I guess. I trained, I started my training as a healer 40 years ago. So instilled in me is an understanding of energy medicine, which is a holistic approach to how we work as beings on this planet. So how the body interacts, how the heart interacts, is an integral part of us. Another way of saying that is that the whole of us needs to be taken into consideration in the healing process. So some psychological therapy deals with that, just psychology, just the workings of the mind, interpreted as the brain, as separate from the body, which is ancient science now, based on Newtonian physics, that the brain works separately from body and never the twain shall meet. In modern interpretations of science, and I'm talking about quantum physics here, there isn't a separation. The body can't work without the brain and vice versa. Both are integrally unified. And in actual fact, we exist in our day-to-day in the conscious mind, which you could equate to the left brain. And it's terribly important to our existence that we have access to that mind and its workings. However, it constitutes about 0.0001% of the workings of our brain. The rest of it is unconscious and could be called the right hand side of the brain. It's not strictly how it's anatomically structured, but for ease of language, I will refer to the left and right side of the brain. So the right side of the brain is the unconscious. It runs our body and our heart. So how our body works is connected to how our mind works, and inextricably so. So our body responds to trauma. In fact, trauma is stored in the body very often, and the mind doesn't always have conscious cognizance of what is going on in our bodies when we become triggered with a traumatic reaction. So you'll get nervous, you'll react and start to shake, or whatever you do when you get triggered into your trauma. And that happens without your brain understanding one iota of what the hell just happened. Maybe you suddenly smelt lilies and it reminded you of something that happened in the past associated with the smell of lilies, and you get triggered and you think, what the hell was that? Why did I suddenly get nervous or cease functioning or walk out of the room or swear at somebody? What did I do that for? I wish I hadn't done it. In sometimes you might call that a Freudian slip, but actually what it is that the body responded to a traumatic trigger. and the conscious mind knew nothing about it, and that came from the right brain. So we can't heal the mind and who and what we are without paying attention to all parts of us. And the right hand unconscious side of the brain can understand language but doesn't speak it. So we need to work with parts of ourselves that are not able to communicate with us in language, which is why I work with dreams, because that's the unconscious speaking. However weird dreams sound, there's a way of interpreting what's being communicated. I work as a healer and offer healing in trauma recovery, because that's connecting directly to the body and our body's energy. And so that gives me access to the unconscious mind, and at a deeper level, access to their energies and how that works in their body. So it's a multidimensional approach to trauma healing, and has to be, because all of us is traumatized, not just the mind. There is also the theory that the brain is part of our mind, but not the whole of it, that the brain is a filter for universal consciousness. So the mind actually expands beyond the brain and can access the universe and what's going on at an energetic level within us and without us. And working on that basis means that that would then take us into spiritual realms or multidimensional realms, or whatever you might want to call that. So that can't actually be proven, although if you start looking at quantum physics, you begin to understand more what I'm talking about here, that we connect with a universal mind, or what quantum physics calls the no thing, the empty space in space that's not empty, but is conscious in some way. And there we can access information that can help us and support us understand what is happening to us. Because it includes all parts of them in the healing process. And even if we never talk about it and they never become aware of it, that is what is happening. So if we just understand things psychologically, understanding comes from the left brain. So we can understand intellectually a very great deal of information, but it doesn't necessarily change how we behave. If, however, we are able to effectively chew up that information and swallow it, in other words, embody it, bring that understanding into us, into the body, and therefore at an emotional level, that can change behaviors. So that's why it's important for there to be a holistic approach, because the body is what holds the trauma, and it's the body that needs healing in order for us not to respond to historic trauma in the present all the time. And that won't happen if we just have an intellectual understanding of what happened to us. It needs to go deeper than that. It means that, so for instance, one of the things that happens with trauma is that we get triggered in the moment by something. We don't always necessarily know what, or even understand why this thing triggers us. So for instance, one sign of somebody who's been traumatized is the jump reflex. And if somebody is very jumpy, a sudden noise or anything that happens suddenly, unexpectedly, it's a sign that they have trauma in their history. But that's coming from the body, and the person jumps without being, in other words, it doesn't come through the conscious mind. So say, for instance, a car drives by and toots its horn. Person jumps, it's immediate. They haven't had time for that reaction to go through their conscious mind. In other words, it doesn't go, oh, look, there's a car gone by and it's just bibbed its horn. Goodness, that reminds me of when my cat got run over 10 years ago. And I'm scared to think of that thought because it's horrific to me. So that I associate that noise then with my cat being killed. Oh, jump. Because that took however long that just took me to say that. And it doesn't take that long. It works through the body. The body has remembered the trauma. And you may not necessarily consciously associate the sound of a horn with the day your cat got killed. So what we do with working with a trigger, which is that jump reflex, is somebody triggered, and that's the reflex they get because oh, jump, now I'm frightened, now I've got to take some reaction. What have I got to do? Have I got to run away from here? Have I got to fight the car? So it's fight, flight, freeze or fawn. Am I just going to freeze in fear and not be able to move? What's going to happen? That happening all the time is not healthy because it stops you living your life fear-free. You're being triggered into fear all the time. But what we can do with some somatic exercises is work directly with that trigger and reduce the effect of it. So over time, what your mind is able to do is retrain the body to not come up with such a big response to when somebody bibs their horn. And that therefore gradually over time reduces the effect of that trigger and enables you to live a more peaceful life. Yes, it does. So I have various exercises, some of which are on my website that people can try, but I also recommend reading of other people who've done specific work on this. So it would be things like the polyvagal theory from Stephen Porges, and Deb Dana, who's worked with him, has written books about these traumatic responses, and she gives a whole ton of different exercises to do to help you. So we usually recommend people read that book. Or people like Peter Levine have also developed a very specific somatic way of working with the body, which can also be very helpful. Different people respond to different exercises in different ways. So sometimes it's a matter of experimentation, of finding what works for you. So that's what we do. I recommend some exercises, I recommend some readings, and people find their own way through that, and then can take greater control over their own healing. And it might be as simple as something like meditation or a walk in nature as well. Those things heal too. But because trauma affects individuals in very individual ways, sometimes it's a bit like being a bit of a detective to find out what works for the individual. So when a client first approaches me for therapy, we have an informal chat on Zoom to find out if there feels to be some a promise of us being able to form a bond in therapy, to make a relationship that is supportive and safe. And that's the primary decider for me. If I think this person, I can work with this person, and they feel they can work with me, and we initially on first meeting think we're comfortable with each other, then I would probably take them on. But if that doesn't feel like that, and I think we're not speaking the same language, I'm not sure that we can build a rapport, then I won't take them on. And it doesn't really matter so much what their initial presentation is, what their problem is as such, but whether I feel we can build a relationship, because creating that relationship creates safety, which is the first premise for therapeutic working. So I don't categorize people into, oh, I don't work with that kind of person, but I do work with this kind of person. I work with people with whom I think we can build a trusting relationship. And then whatever emerges out of that lands in a safe place. Now, sometimes it happens with that they have a need that I can't meet. And so, for instance, they might need much deeper physical massage for the body to release some of its traumas. Or they might need to do something else therapeutically before what I do works, in which case then I'll work with another therapist, refer them on, go get that fixed, whatever, come back to me, or stay working with me while you're doing that, because no one therapist can fix everything. In some fix, wrong word, can work with everybody. So Carl Jung was a student of Freud. He was a medical doctor and a psychiatrist, and then trained as a psychoanalyst with Freud. So he was psychodynamic, if that means anything to the theoreticians here. But then eventually broke away from Freud because they discovered there were fundamental beliefs of Freud's that Jung could not adopt. So Freud concentrated a lot on sexual drives in his work, just to look at one element. And Freud did not believe that sexual drives alone is what makes us human. He had a much broader spectrum understanding of that. So they broke away, much to Freud's consternation. It was devastating, to Jung's consternation. It was devastating to him. He looked upon Freud as a father figure, but they did split, and Jung continued to develop in his own way. He also studied society, traveled the world, looked at all different types of people, indigenous tribes and their spiritual practices and their medicine practices, which were inextricably tied up with their spirituality quite often. So he had a much more broader spectrum understanding of humanity beyond the psychological, which is one of the reasons I admire him so much. And his lifetime's work is enormous. I haven't read all of his stuff because it's not possible to read it all. He was prolific in his lectures and his books, and some of which I'll freely admit is beyond me because it's quite hard to understand something. But these basic concepts I've read quite extensively about Jung, but I probably never read all of his stuff across my lifetime, to be honest. And I've studied other psychologists as well, and do integrate other theories into my work. But my basic premise is that Jung was my major teacher, and I have great respect for him. And I just love that his breadth of wisdom went beyond the psychological. So he was more holistic, though I don't think he would have ever used that term in his approach to people's healing. And it worked. He also worked with dreams, he worked with mandalas. So he worked with the body as well, because that's what that's doing, working with the unconscious mind and living the unconscious, working with ways of allowing the unconscious mind to communicate with us, which to me is incredibly important. So it is a more holistic approach. And the master's degree that I did was called Jungian psychotherapy. Seeing somebody walk out of my therapy room able to live a more integrated life, that's what brings me joy. That sounds weird, sending clients away, I guess is what I'm saying, is that they leave me feeling that they know better how to live their life now, and they know better who they are, and therefore what they want to do in their life to feel more complete. I find that they are obviously people who are attracted to the content on my website. And I think that content describes a multidimensional approach to who and what we are, which means a deep inner process. So Jung called his own approach to psychology depth psychology, and I enjoy working at a deep level with people. So I don't just look at the superficial. We dig into that to find out what might be going underneath that, and what's going on underneath that, and what's going on underneath that, until we get, I suppose, to the causal layer. What's really causing this, if that's possible. It's not always possible in one go, but yes, I like a depth approach to my work now, and I like thinking things through and reading around that kind of area. So about a decade ago, I discovered Elaine Aron's work on highly sensitive people, and that feeds into that quite strongly. And she describes a type of person who is more sensitive than the norm. She wrote her dissertation on this, her doctoral dissertation, and discovered that about 16% of the population feel more than the rest do. And I realized in reading her book that I'm one of those people. So that makes me HSP, highly sensitive person. Now, some of that can be related to trauma, because one of the symptoms of trauma is something called hypervigilance. So if you are in an environment with unpredictable parents, children can become absolutely whiz at reading their parents' body language, and therefore being able to predict when they're going to become unpredictable and dangerous to be around. And they read that body language, get out of the way, or develop adaptive behaviors to manage that when the parent is not safe to be around. So that's called hypervigilance. They're very observant. And that obviously contributes to being highly sensitive, but I don't think it's the whole picture. I think there's more to it than that. People tend to be born highly sensitive. So you could argue that that's epigenetics then, and you've inherited traumatic responses, and maybe that's true, and maybe we'll never know for sure what the answer is to that. But the consequence of it is that I pick up a very great deal of information from people that's not verbal. And that makes it sometimes quite difficult for me to be in crowds, because I can come away with all of everybody else's stuff if I don't protect myself. It's one of the things that took me to energy medicine, to learn how to protect my energy, not to have it overly invaded by other people's energy. It's why my boundaries tend to be pretty tight most of the time in the way that I work, because otherwise I get overwhelmed and overloaded by other people's stuff, whatever that is. But it is also a massive superpower for a therapist to be very sensitive to the other, because I can anticipate often what is happening with my client before they do. In fact, my supervisor, love her dearly, said something to me the other day. We both came online, we were just about to start working, and we do the normal niceties, how are you, blah, blah, blah. And she said, I'm fine, thank you. When I asked her, and I said, no, you're not, what's going on? And she said, damn it, you're the person who I can never lie to. And she just had a minor operation and she was feeling quite under the weather. And I just picked that up just in the change stance. And that was on Zoom. And some people might not have noticed that at all. And that's commonly what I do. And I can normally tell when my client walks in the room, you're different today, what's happened? Something's happened. And they don't always realize something that's happened. And then they go, oh, well, thinking about it, so-and-so occurred, and of course that's upset me, or that made me feel great, or whatever. And I will pick it up in them as soon as they walk in the room. And that's part of it. So it means I have to take care of my energy as an HSP, but it also, and I mostly work with it as an amazing superpower, because it enables me to read a room, to read an environment, to read people, and to know what's happening. And that informs me and allows me to keep myself safe most of the time. Forgotten the question again, but anyway, that's So my ideal client. So I find that I attract a lot of HSPs into the room as clients because they pick that up from me, even though up until now that's not specifically mentioned on my website. And that's probably because I work in a multidimensional way, and that's evident from the website. And those HSPs are often multidimensionally aware. And what I mean by that is that because I'm a healer, because I'm also training as a medium at the moment, I have no intention to work as a medium, but it's just increasing my sensitivities, which means that I am aware of other dimensions of existence other than this third dimension, which with the physical dimension that we live in. And that for me is real. Once again, that doesn't necessarily come into psychotherapy, but it comes into soul work, which I also offer. So people interested in other dimensions are also my ideal client, and I'm willing to talk about that. I'm willing to talk with people about their own spirituality and how they interpret what they've experienced and work with them, not necessarily to impose my views of what that is, because this is a very subjective area and there are no hard and fast lines and rules, but there are ways of keeping yourself safe working with this, which is very important. So I'm happy to work with people as they explore their own spirituality and their experience of the numinous. I suppose in a sense it relates to people who are spiritual seekers and the soul work. So intuitive coaching is not life coaching, it's not business coaching. It's again about, for me anyway, it's about working in a multidimensional way with your sense of self and expanding your sense of self. So it might be that you're asking spiritual questions, or you've come to a point in your life where you think, well, is that it then? You know, I've got 3 kids and a budgie and a fish pond in the garden, and I've got a nice car and a nice home, and my career's, you know, set and on track. Is that all there is? Is there not more to life than this? Because there's a piece of me that feels incomplete or not even started yet. And that's quite a good position to start exploring what else there might be for one in life. Usually starts in the 40s when we ask those questions. And I guess that's because we're starting to come closer to our sense of mortality up till and during the 30s, up to those sorts of ages, generally speaking, we are immortal. And we're going to live forever, and we're going to change the world, and we're going to get all these oldies out of the way and make massive, incredible improvements to the way everything works. You know, we're in that idealistic, youthful stage of life, and then shit happens, or stuff happens, or whatever. We come more into our 40s, and we think, well, I haven't answered all the questions I've got. I need to understand more. And maybe that's a philosophical or more a theoretical journey, exploration into the meaning of life. And that's a good place then to have some intuitive coaching.